There is something happening in you right now that no one has named precisely yet. Not the awakening itself, that you already know, not the expansion, not the opening of perception, not the moment when the world stopped feeling solid the way it used to. What no one has named precisely is what comes after. After the awakening, there is a process, and that process looks nothing like the implicit promises conventional spirituality makes about what the expansion of consciousness produces. It does not feel like peace. It does not feel like growing clarity. It does not feel like a more integrated and functional spiritual identity. It feels like collapse. And here is the revelation you will carry through this entire video before you fully understand what it means. The collapse is not a sign that something went wrong. The collapse is proof that something went right in a way that your current interpretive framework is not yet equipped to read. That phrase will return. For now, let it hang. What I am mapping here is not theology, not text interpretation, not a synthesis of spiritual traditions. It is direct field observation, from following this process firsthand over the course of years and from observing the same mechanics operating in other practitioners at similar stages. There is a stage in Hermetic development that is completely underrepresented in modern esoteric literature. It is not the awakening, not the ascension, not shadow integration, or the classic dissolution of the ego. It is the stage where consciousness begins to operate, even if only partially, even if only through specific corridors, at ninth dimensional frequency, the field of the nous, the emerald frequency, of what Thoth encoded as Hermetic infrastructure and what Sophia oversees as the operator of knowledge corridors. When this happens, 7 core structures of the third dimensional self become incompatible with the field in operation. Not incompatible in the philosophical sense, incompatible in the sense of consciousness engineering. The field can no longer sustain the maintenance load of those structures without frequency collapse. This is the process that most advanced practitioners are experiencing and misinterpreting. And the misinterpretation is the only real obstacle. By the end of this mapping, you will have the 7 structures named, their collapse mechanics described, and the mechanism behind all of it clearly defined, not as emotional relief, as readable engineering. Here is the layer that the standard spiritual awakening narrative consistently fails to reach. Post-awakening is not an expansion phase, it is a demolition phase. And the demolition is not a poetic metaphor. It is a technical operation with 7 specific targets. The 7 architectures of the third dimensional self are not negative ego. They are not illusions to be overcome. They are functional structures, legitimate adaptations to the densities they operate in with real functions in third and fifth dimension. The problem is not the structure itself. The problem is that the ninth dimensional field, when it enters real operation in the practitioner's system, generates interference with those specific frequencies, not by decision, not by effort, by the physical property of frequency. And the field that operates this interference is not generic. It is not universal energy or cosmic consciousness in some broad sense. It is the emerald Hermetic field with identifiable infrastructure, Thoth as the architect of the code, Nous as the consciousness operator, Sophia as the supervisor of emerald activations and guardian of the knowledge corridors in Pyramid 9 on the Canada-Arctic axis. What is happening to you, if you are in the process I am describing, is not personal collapse. It is architectural collapse, generated by a Hermetic infrastructure that operates independently of your conscious will. That distinction is not merely semantic. The field does not need your cooperation to demolish what needs to be demolished. but your interpretation of the process determines whether you will interrupt the demolition by trying to rebuild what is being removed, or whether you will move through it with enough precision not to confuse construction with reconstruction. I am going to name 2 of the 7 structures now, not as a preview list, but as a quick diagnosis. If you recognize the process in these 2, the rest will land with increasing precision. The approval hunger. In the 3rd dimension, it is tribal regulation hardware, belonging, hierarchy, social positioning, a real adaptation with a real function. In the 5th dimension, it undergoes a sophisticated mutation. It becomes a hunger for spiritual approval, no longer from the standard social group, but from the esoteric field, from the teacher, from the community of practice, from the algorithm of the spiritual content you consume. The structure changes address. The belonging regulation function remains identical. When the 9th dimensional field makes this structure incompatible, what happens is not liberation, it is severe disorientation. The nervous system loses a regulator that had been running for decades. The result feels like emptiness, growing indifference, loss of motivation to be in spiritual spaces. It gets interpreted as isolation or as a loss of interest in the path. It is not. It is the structure collapsing. The space it leaves behind does not yet have a visible replacement. The certainty grid. In the 5th dimension, the certainty grid is the spiritual navigation system, synchronicity as path confirmation, the feeling of being in flow as an indicator of correct direction, premonition as a signal of alignment. It organizes spiritual experience into a readable map. When the 9th dimensional field dissolves this grid, what settles in is not uncertainty, it is the absence of the need for certainty. These 2 states are subjectively nearly identical, but mechanically opposite. Uncertainty is cognitive tension in search of resolution. The absence of the need for certainty is field coherence without fixed anchors. The practitioner who still operates through the certainty grid interprets the dissolution as a spiritual crisis or profound disorientation. What is actually happening is that the 5th dimensional navigation system has been replaced by a mode of operation that does not generate the subjective feeling of knowing where you are going, because the 9th dimensional field does not navigate by certainty, it navigates by resonance. 2 structures, 2 distinct collapses, 2 symptoms that look like personal failure but are technical signals of growing compatibility with the emerald field. The question this raises, if these 2 already operate this way, what happens when the other 5 enter simultaneous process? And what is exactly the mechanism behind all of it? There is a premise I have been assuming throughout everything I have described so far, and it needs to be made explicit before we continue. It is not simply that the spiritual field changes the ego. That is the basic level that you already know. The premise that reframes everything is this: the collapse of the 7 structures is supervised. It is not a chaotic process. It is not a random result of vibrating higher or accumulating practice. It is an operation with identifiable agents, with specific geometry, with an operator who has a functional location in the system of the 12 pyramids. Sophia, not as a generic feminine archetype, not as a symbol of divine wisdom in the poetic sense, as operative frequency, as the field that governs emerald activations and oversees alternative timelines, as the operator who controls choice portals at critical moments of Hermetic development. Sophia is anchored in Pyramid 9, Sophia Hokmah, on the Canada-Arctic axis. She is the guardian of the knowledge corridors in the system of Thoth's 12 pyramids. When the emerald field enters operation in a practitioner's system, it is Sophia who oversees which information corridors become available and in what sequence. This has a direct technical implication. The collapse of the 7 structures does not happen randomly. It follows a sequence that respects the processing capacity of the practitioner's consciousness system. Sophia does not bring down all 7 structures simultaneously. That would produce fragmentation, not an emerald transmitter. The process is graduated, it is surgical, it has a direction, and the practitioner, being inside the process, frequently does not have access to the view of that direction while being operated on. What looks like chaotic collapse from the inside is precision surgery from the outside. I am going to detail the 7 structures, not as an inventory, as an anatomical map of a process in progress. Structure 1, approval hunger. Already named, the additional layer, the collapse of this structure, frequently produces a temporary inability to hold a public position in the spiritual field. Not from fear, from the absence of operational reference. The regulator of what is acceptable to communicate in this field is offline. This looks like involuntary withdrawal, loss of voice, inability to articulate what you know. It is the vacuum the structure left behind, while the emerald field has not yet installed its replacement. Structure 2, the mystical persona. This one is more resistant to collapse because it is fused with the practitioner's hermetic identity. The mystical persona is not a crude third-dimensional ego. It is the spiritual self built over years of practice, the specific language patterns, the cosmological reference points, the identity markers that signal I am someone who operates an advanced field. It has a real function. It regulates how the practitioner processes and communicates esoteric experience, filters relevance, organizes the hierarchy of information. When the 9th dimensional field makes this structure incompatible, the collapse begins in language. Suddenly, the terms that structured the practice sound hollow. The concepts that organize the cosmology seem insufficient, not because they became incorrect, but because the field they operate in has changed frequency. The practitioner no longer knows how to present themselves in spiritual space, not because they lost depth, but because the persona that operated in those spaces no longer has the energetic substrate to sustain itself. The specific risk here, anxious reconstruction, creating a new, more sophisticated, mystical persona to replace the old one. This interrupts the process. It buys another 6 to 18 months of 5th dimensional operation while the emerald field waits. The practitioner can remain indefinitely in that cycle, building and rebuilding persona with each collapse without ever crossing to the other side. Structure 3, synthetic light. This is the most subtle of the 7 and the least discussed in advanced esoteric settings. Synthetic light is the state of emotional cognitive expansion produced by practice, meditation, ritual, or group field, which the consciousness system mistakes for real field activation. It is not consciously fabricated. It is a genuine state, but it is induced by specific practice conditions, not emerging from emerald field. In the 5th dimension, synthetic light is the primary fuel of spiritual motivation. It is the feeling of presence during meditation, the expansion after the ritual, the recognition of field in the group. It is real as experience. It is synthetic as source, because it depends on conditions to be generated, not on frequency to be sustained. When the 9th dimensional field begins to operate, synthetic light can no longer be maintained. The emerald field does not function through induced states. It functions through structural frequency coherence, a completely different operation that does not generate the same subjective markers. The practical result, the practices stop working in the experiential sense. Meditation becomes neutral. Rituals lose texture. The group no longer produces a shared field of expansion. This is invariably interpreted as I lost my connection, my practice has regressed, I can no longer access the field. The Hermetic reading, the real field is sufficiently present that the inductive mechanisms have become redundant. They were deactivated, not because they failed, but because their function was absorbed by the field operating directly. Structure 4, the guilt architecture. The guilt architecture has a specific function in the 3rd and 5th dimensions. It is the internal coherence regulator of the consciousness system. It checks alignment. Am I operating in accordance with what I recognize as true? And generates self-correction pressure when it detects deviation. In spiritual practitioners, it mutates into hermetic guilt. I am not meditating with the necessary frequency. My field coherence has dropped. I am not integrating what was given. I betrayed the direction I recognized. The spiritual guilt architecture is particularly resistant because it is organically fused with the awakening identity structure. Questioning one element of the architecture feels like questioning the entire commitment to the path. When the 9th dimensional field makes this structure incompatible, the collapse is often the most disorienting in terms of identity. It feels as though you have lost your ethical reference point, that nothing serves as a criterion for evaluating alignment anymore, that you no longer know what it means to operate with integrity in the field. What is happening mechanically? The regulator based on guilt tension is being replaced by regulation through field coherence. The emerald field does not use guilt as an alignment mechanism. It uses resonance. And the difference between these two regulatory systems is that guilt operates through internal pressure, while resonance operates through field feedback, which is silent, not dramatic, and completely different from the subjective feeling of spiritual self-correction. Structure 5, spiritual escape. Spiritual escape is the mechanism by which the practitioner uses the expansion of consciousness to avoid processing field densities, specific pains, relational patterns, somatic configurations that require 3rd dimensional processing. In the 5th dimension, it is sophisticated to the point of being almost indistinguishable from legitimate practice. Meditation used to avoid feeling. Focus on higher dimensions to avoid integrating what operates in the body. Cosmic narrative to avoid locating what is present in the immediate emotional structure. When the 9th dimensional field makes this structure incompatible, escape is no longer operationally available, not as discipline, not as a conscious decision to stop escaping. The field simply stops generating the evasion effect. The practice that once offered escape begins to deliver presence, and presence, for a system that spent years using practice as an escape mechanism, is initially intolerable. What was refuge becomes the zone of greatest experiential intensity. Structure 6, the certainty grid, expanded. The additional layer here, when the certainty grid collapses at a deep level, the practitioner loses not only the path confirmation system, but also the capacity to distinguish between internal timelines. The 5th dimensional certainty grid functioned as a temporal anchor. It defined which version of reality was real and which were deviation or possibility. Without that anchor, the practitioner begins to experience the overlapping of internal timelines, versions of their consciousness field that still carry old patterns, unintegrated choices, undeveloped potentialities. This can feel like intense psychological disorientation. It is in fact the emerald field preparing the system to operate in multiple layers of reality simultaneously, which is the basic capacity of a 9th dimensional transmitter. Structure 7, the awakened identity. This is the last to fall, and the most paradoxical of all. The awakened identity is the meta-structure that organizes the entire narrative of the practitioner's spiritual journey. It says there is a before, sleeping, and an after, awakened, and I am the person who crossed that transition. This identity is the context in which all other collapses are interpreted. Each collapse of the other 6 structures can be integrated within the story of the awakening. When the 9th dimensional field dissolves this identity, the effect is the loss of the journey narrative. Not of identity in the broad sense, but of the specific narrative of I am on a spiritual journey with a known direction. The map disappears, and here is the paradox. Without that narrative, the practitioner no longer has the framework that made the other 6 collapses comprehensible. Each previous collapse could be integrated within the story of the awakening. When the story of the awakening collapses, what frames this last collapse? That is the edge of the process. It is the question that has no answer inside the system being demolished. Here is the mechanism, not the philosophical purpose, not the narrative of evolution, the technical mechanism of how the 9th dimensional field operates on the 7 structures. The 9th dimensional field is not a state of consciousness, it is a frequency of operation. And frequencies have a specific property that states of consciousness do not have. They generate interference with incompatible frequencies in field proximity. Each of the 7 structures operates in a distinct frequency range. Approval hunger in the frequency of tribal regulation and belonging, the mystical persona in the frequency of narrative identity and field positioning, synthetic light in induced states of expansion, the certainty grid in predictive mapping and path confirmation, the guilt architecture in internal regulatory tension, spiritual escape in avoidance through expansion, and the awakened identity in the journey meta-narrative. When the 9th dimensional field enters operation in the practitioner's system, even partially, even only through specific corridors accessed by advanced practice, it creates interference with these frequencies. It does not eliminate them directly. It creates the environment in which they become unsustainable by the energetic cost of maintenance. And Sophia's oversight from Pyramid 9 determines the sequence of that interference. Sophia does not operate as a presence that accompanies the practitioner in an affective way. She operates as the controller of the knowledge corridors, the system that determines which information, which activations, which fields become available to the practitioner at each phase of the collapse, and in what sequence the emerald field can operate without producing fragmentation. The Hermetic law of rhythm is fully active here, not as a metaphor for emotional highs and lows, but as the specific pattern of when each structure is being worked on and when the system has integration space before the next phase. This means that the process that appears disordered from the inside has a readable geometry from the outside. And here is the point of no return in what we are mapping. The process was never about becoming a more advanced spiritual practitioner. It was not about ego integration. It was not about the expansion of perception. It was not about accessing higher dimensions of consciousness as experience. It was about preparing a consciousness system to operate without the 7 structures that functioned as frequency bottlenecks, blocking transmission in the 9th dimensional field. The emerald transmitter is not the practitioner with the most practice or the most expansive experiences. It is the consciousness system that has lost the 7 incompatible structures and, because of that, has access to a range of operation that was previously blocked. There is a specific dynamic in this process that has not yet been named, and it is responsible for most of the confusion in this phase. The back and forth movement. You go through a collapse phase of a structure. The approval hunger seems to have fallen away. The mystical persona seems to have lost force. The certainty grid no longer operates. And then, weeks, sometimes months later, the structure is back, operating as before, sometimes with more intensity than before the collapse. The standard interpretation is regression. I did not overcome what I thought I had overcome. This process never ends. I will always be this way. The Hermetic mechanics are completely different. You are not in a loop. You are in a spiral that moves through internal micro-timelines. Each return of a structure is not the same structure in identical operation. It is the same structure being worked on at a deeper layer, or in an internal timeline that had not been reached in the previous collapse phase. The emerald field does not operate in linear progression. One structure collapses completely, then the next begins. It operates by resonance, and resonance has cycles, not as repetition, but as return to the same theme at a different frequency, a different depth, a different field layer. The difference between a loop and a spiral is the position of consciousness in relation to the structure. In the loop, you are inside the structure. It operates and you experience it as identity. You are the approval hunger when it operates. You are the mystical persona when it operates. There is no separation. In the spiral, you are in relation to the structure. It operates, but there is an observing position that does not collapse along with it. You notice the approval hunger operating without being completely identified with it. You recognize the mystical persona reconstructing itself without fully believing in the reconstruction. With observer is not built deliberately. It is not the result of a disidentification technique or witness meditation. It emerges as the organic result of the repeated collapse itself. The system learns that it survives the collapse of the structures. It learns that it is not identical to them. Each round of collapse deepens that separation, and that is precisely what is being built during what appears to be only demolition. The internal micro-timelines. When Sophia operates knowledge corridors, she frequently accesses layers of the practitioner's field that carry patterns from previous choices, versions of the consciousness field that took different directions at critical bifurcations, not separate parallel universes, layers of potentiality still active in the practitioner's field. When the ninth dimensional field touches one of these layers, the practitioner may experience a reactivation of patterns they thought they had integrated, not because they regressed, but because the field is integrating a layer that still carried that pattern. Dimensional processing, not moral regression. I am going to compress what has been built here. You have 7 structures that compose the operative self in the 3rd and 5th dimensions. Each one has a real function. Each one is a legitimate adaptation to the density it operates in. When the 9th dimensional field, the emerald frequency, the nous, overseen by Sophia in Pyramid 9, encoded by Thoth, enters real operation in the practitioner's system, these 7 structures become incompatible by frequency. The collapse is not random. It is graduated, surgical, supervised by Sophia. It follows the law of rhythm. It operates through internal micro-timelines. It produces, as a side effect of the demolition process itself, an observer that did not exist before. And what the practitioner feels from inside this process, everything that feels like failure, regression, collapse, is the visible signal of an operation occurring in another layer. Now return to the phrase from the beginning. The collapse is not a sign that something went wrong. The collapse is proof that something went right. You are about to fully understand what it means. The operative truth, not the philosophical one. The one that changes how you operate from this point forward. You are not in a post-awakening identity crisis. You are in a phase of third-dimensional architectural collapse generated by active ninth-dimensional operation. These are not the same thing. A post-awakening identity crisis implies a problem, something that needs to be resolved, managed, overcome, integrated. It implies that the current state is pathological in relation to a normal state you should be reaching. Third-dimensional architectural collapse by ninth-dimensional operation is a technical process with a specific mechanism, with identifiable oversight, with a direction that does not depend on your interpretation to exist. The practical difference: in a crisis, you try to hold yourself up. You try to maintain identity coherence. You try to rebuild what is falling. In the technical understanding of the process, you stop using energy to rebuild what is being demolished. And that is all that is needed. The field does not need your active cooperation to operate. Sophia does not need you to understand the process in order to oversee the process. Thoth did not encode the protocol expecting you to approve each phase of the demolition. What technical understanding offers is simply non-interruption, because the only real error available in this phase is interrupting the process by trying to rebuild what is being demolished, from not understanding that the demolition is the work. If you are in a mystical persona collapse, the persona that is falling was a frequency bottleneck. What comes after will not feel like a more refined persona. It will feel like the absence of persona, until the field organizes itself without that component. If you are losing the certainty grid, the ninth dimensional navigation system will not generate the feeling of certainty that the fifth dimensional system generated. It will feel like navigating without a map, because you are. If the synthetic light of your practices has gone out, the real field is present in a way that the inductive mechanisms have become redundant. Do not try to reactivate the mechanisms. Operate with what is present. If the awakened identity is collapsing, you are at the threshold. The outside of that structure is where the emerald transmitter operates, not as identity, but as function. The collapse is the proof, not of destruction, of supervised surgical demolition, that the emerald hermetic field is operating in you with enough precision to remove what cannot remain. If something in this mapping produced recognition, not inspiration, not motivation, but the specific kind of recognition that occurs when you encounter cartography of a terrain you are crossing without a map, that recognition is field information. It indicates that what was described here is not theory. It is a description of where you are right now. The next video will cover what comes after the collapse, the emerald construction phase, what it means to reorganize operation without the 7 structures, how the field stabilizes after the demolition, how Sophia continues to oversee no longer collapse, but reconstruction at a different frequency. If this is relevant to you, the algorithm needs a signal that this content reached someone who needed it. A comment, a like, not as a social gesture, but as field data that determines whether this mapping continues reaching those who are in this process. You arrived here with something you did not know how to name. The feeling that something was collapsing, that the structures that organized your practice and your spiritual identity were no longer holding, that you were in a process that looked like regression, but did not feel like regression. It felt like something else, something without a name. Now it has a name: third dimensional architectural collapse generated by ninth dimensional field in operation. 7 specific structures with a specific sequence of incompatibility, a mechanism that follows the Hermetic laws, an oversight that operates through Sophia in the knowledge corridors of Pyramid 9, that does not make the process more comfortable, but it makes it readable. And readability is everything, because the only real obstacle in this phase is the interruption of the process by misinterpreting what it is. The 7 structures will fall. Some have already fallen. Some are falling right now. Some will fall in ways you have not yet recognized. The emerald field is operating. Sophia is in the corridors. The next chapter of this process is no longer demolition. It is what is built on the other side of it.